In today's lesson, I want to talk to you about some theories of racial disparities or racial inequality in housing. Now, before structural racism was the most popular or most agreed upon theory to explain the patterns we see in terms of segregation or housing disparities, there was another dominant theory in sociology, one that pointed to structural economics as the main explanation for these patterns we see. Now, for most Americans, when they look at a map of segregation, a map like these on the slide, they either say that the patterns we see relate to preferences, differences in where people live relate to different preferences for different types of houses, different types of geographies, etc. It either relates to preferences or it relates to class and economics or people's buying power. I'm going to share a popular theory that fits in this class matters more than race argument. And it's a theory that comes out of sociology, one that was popular from the 70s to the early 90s. And then I'm going to end with the dominant theory in sociology, structural racism, which exists as a rebuttal to this original argument. Both of these theories, even though they seem like they challenge each other, actually speak to the underlying issue of structural racism or institutional racism. These theories point out ways that preferences and even the buying power for African Americans has been constrained by racism in housing. So it's not that preferences don't matter or don't shape our experiences, and it's not that class, our economics, or money doesn't shape our opportunities and our experiences. It's that there is this third variable that is race and racism in American society that has implications for both of those other two factors. When the federal government first financed housing, both large-scale housing, public housing, and private mortgage loan programs, it was with the intention to house all Americans, to make sure all Americans had a place to live. Industrialization had pulled millions of Americans from farms and rural areas and small towns into industrializing cities or urban areas. The pre-war immigration waves and some internal migrations led to a population boom. Large-scale public housing was one way that American society decided to resolve this issue of a housing shortage coupled with a population boom. Now, housing projects were not always segregated. Some of them became integrated pretty quickly. Even in the South, black and white residents, for example, would live in separate buildings, but they would be a part of the same property. However, problems in cities began to emerge, or rather, there were already some problems that were plaguing cities. A population boom and a housing shortage represented one set of problems that were facing cities, overcrowding, that is. But other problems began to emerge. So, white Americans quickly took advantage of federally sponsored mortgage programs and moved out of overcrowded urban areas in droves, exercising their preferences for non-urban, but also for non-integrated living. Neighborhoods on the urban fringes, or the suburbs, typically were developed with deed restrictions that banned the sale of homes to undesirables. And undesirables could include a lot of different things, but in every single case, undesirables included black families. The synergistic effects of all of these changes in migration and economics and housing left the poorest and most disadvantaged residents behind. Eventually, entire cities declined, leading to what urban sociologists and historians refer to as the urban crisis. Between 1970 and the year 2000, give or take, cities across the country experienced deindustrialization and economic decline. Sociologist William Julius Wilson, who is featured in a video this week on Canvas, he raised an important question in the 1970s. He wanted to know if the disparities that we see, or historically that we saw in black urban neighborhoods, was a matter of economics or if it was a matter of ongoing racism. Deindustrialization and economic decline are significant in this conversation because due to urbanization, Americans had shifted from a rural to an urban society. Graphs like the one on the slide show us that. They do not tell us how the structural shifts played out in every family or group, in every geography, etc. Again, graphs like these tell us generalizable, broad, macro level patterns, but we don't get the nitty-gritty details. They also don't tell us what else was going on in society that may have intersected with these macro trends. If industrial capitalism was a major pull factor in bringing people to cities, deindustrialization characterizes the period of the urban crisis, again beginning at around the year 1970. Cities were losing not only their people, not only were residents who had the means able to, and who were not considered undesirables, able to escape the overcrowding city, they were also able to escape right before this period of massive divestment and deindustrialization. So not only did residents begin to leave cities, so did industries and the jobs that they provided. They also began to leave cities, where again, during the period of industrialization and urbanization, cities and the jobs that they provided were the major pull factor bringing people to urban areas. And right around the 1970s, this begins to shift a little bit. One of the results of these structural shifts, deindustrialization and the out-migration of people with means from the cities to suburbs, also called suburbanization. One of the results of this is that cities emptied out. They became jobless, and the urban residents who were left behind became poorer. These are maps of Milwaukee, Wisconsin on the slide here. On the left is the year 1970. On the right is the year 2010. And as you can see depicted in this graphic here, particular neighborhoods went into steep economic decline in those 40 years between 1970 and 2010. This represents an economic shift that's happening, a structural economic shift that's happening. But what is the connection with the black experience specifically? At the same time as cities were beginning to empty, African Americans were still in the process of moving to cities during what historians and sociologists and other scholars refer to as the Great Migration. And the Great Migration is a period between approximately 1910 and 1970 where millions, over 6 million African Americans moved from the rural South to the urban non-South. And there's a slow start in 1910. And we've learned about some historical factors that would have explained why there was a slow start. Mainly because of high levels of overt racism, especially in the South, excluding African Americans from property rights and other forms of movement. There was also not a lot of industry in cities until the period of industrialization. But there's a slow start to this migration in 1910. It's halted or slowed down a little bit during the Depression years. And then there's this huge uptick again after World War II. The graphs on the slide here show the outcomes of the Great Migration on black geography. So again, in 1900, the majority of African Americans reside in the rural South. And then by the year 2000, the majority of African Americans are now an urban population, meaning they live in cities, both in the South, cities like Atlanta and Birmingham, but also spread across the United States. This is another graphical representation of the Great Migration. The downward slope on the right side of the graph, beginning again around 1910 and ending or plateauing around 1970, that is what historians refer to as the Great Migration. Now, even the 53 to 57% of African Americans who reside in the South, nowadays, the majority of that percentage still is urban, as opposed to small town, rural, or suburban. This is a map version of the same data. African Americans went from living in the rural South almost exclusively in 1900 to an urban people spread across cities in the South and in the non-South. And we can see that the clustering of the African American population are in major cities. So in California, cities in the Bay Area and Los Angeles. We can see cities in Florida, in Jacksonville, in Ohio. There's cities like Cleveland and Youngstown. There's cities in Michigan like Detroit. So the large polygons, these large dots, represent major U.S. cities. Beginning in the post-World War II years, Americans who had means, so middle-class Americans, wealthy Americans, began to buy houses on the urban fringes or in the suburbs to avoid the overcrowding of cities. Also, the highway system and the mass production of the automobile allowed transportation to and from cities to be more feasible. So people with means began to buy houses on the fringes and in the suburbs. As this graph shows, by 1980, already more than a decade after the 1968 Fair Housing Act, black families only represented 6% of all suburban residents. In 1980, over 75% of African Americans lived in cities or in urban neighborhoods across the U.S. For the people who follow Wilson's theory, urban inequality, racial inequality in housing, is about the timing of structural changes. It is a perfect storm, so to speak. African Americans arrived to inner city America at a time when cities were restructuring economically. Again, what we call deindustrialization. At the same time, they were experiencing a population drain to the suburbs. So, geographically concentrated poverty, again, the poorest of the poor being left behind in cities. And this development of what Wilson calls the underclass, the urban underclass, it resulted from structural changes in the economy. You combine this with the exodus of middle class and working and wealthy people from inner city neighborhoods, it has some detrimental impacts on black communities who are just beginning to settle, just beginning to kind of thrive in urban America. So not only did people with means leave the city, but also jobs left the city. So black America began to be characterized by certain disparities that we're all probably familiar with today. High rates of long-term joblessness. So not even just unemployment, but not even having people in the neighborhood not even having a job or not being able to keep a job. High levels of out-of-wedlock births compared to mainstream America. Higher rates of school dropouts compared to mainstream America. Higher rates of crime and social disorder compared to mainstream America. Lower average wages for the people so most people can't find a job, but for the ones who do find work, their wages are lower than average. Wilson, again, writing in the 70s, in the 80s, in the early 90s, draws the conclusion that this is largely an issue of economics, and that the fact that it's happening to African Americans is second to the issue of class. If anything, it's just an issue of poor timing, that the Great Migration, because of the history of racism, that restricted African Americans to live in the South during slavery, that delayed the timing of the Great Migration, and that delayed timing just happened to be a perfect storm with all these other structural shifts. That is the sort of economic argument that comes out of sociology. The structural racism argument in sociology does not deny the structural shifts that Wilson points out occurred. However, what they suggest is that without segregation, without legally enforced segregation, none of those changes that Wilson discussed would have had the outcomes that we see. So although the rates of black poverty were driven up by economic dislocations and economic shifts, segregation confined the increased deprivation to a small number of densely settled, tightly packed, and geographically isolated areas. By making it more difficult for minorities to purchase housing, discrimination contributes to disparities in home ownership and wealth accumulation, which in turn foster more residential segregation by impacting people's economics and thus their preferences. Preferences don't matter if people cannot enact their preferences equitably. Today, this is the most accepted theory in sociology because it builds on the earlier theories, and it shows that segregation perpetuates economic inequality, which if you think economics matters the most, then you can't divorce it from these other issues. One of the issues that we've discussed in this class that was covered extensively in the text is the issue of redlining. Without redlining, which was introduced in the 1930s and was outlawed in the 1960s, but still has this ongoing legacy today, without the history of redlining, homeowners may not have ever had the right to discriminate. I mentioned earlier that when suburbia became a popular place to be, many suburbs had racially restrictive deeds or racially restrictive covenants in their deed, meaning they would ban African Americans. Part of the reason why there was an incentive to ban African Americans from your suburban development is because you wanted homeowners that had FHA-backed loans, that had federally backed loans. And African Americans, for a good chunk of recent history, were routinely and unequivocally denied from getting those loans. So without redlining, we may have seen all Americans suburbanize at similar rates. We might not have seen huge disparities in terms of people's home values and the equity that they've accrued in their house, as again the book has pointed out, as several films have pointed out in this class. Without redlining, we may not have extreme disparities in wealth. So without redlining, the question of economics or the question of preferences loses its weight. And then if you're interested in reading up more on this, especially if you're from the region, there is a nonprofit called the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston that has some great infographics. They've done some really interesting audit studies on both the history of redlining and housing discrimination in the Boston area, but also they've made some really interesting and insightful links to how that historical legacy plays out in a major city like Boston today. So if you're interested, click on the link in the slides that I will provide with this video. That's all I have for now. Take care.